Hey guys, tonight we step into one of the strangest, most unsettling, and, let's be honest, kind of sleep-ruining parts of medical history. The story of blood transfusions. Imagine lying on a wooden table in some candlelit chamber, the smell of herbs and hot iron filling the air, while a group of eager men in wigs argue over whether your body might accept sheep's blood as if it were a glass of wine. You probably won't survive this. But don't worry, you only have to listen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and local time, because I always love seeing where and when people are listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're settling in, and your mind drifts back, far back, before hospitals, before microscopes, to a world where blood isn't biology, but magic. In the flickering torchlight of an ancient ritual, you can almost see a priest raising a bowl of crimson liquid skyward, convinced that life itself can be borrowed, bartered, or stolen through blood. Ancient people didn't think of blood as a complex fluid full of proteins and cells. They saw it as the spark of vitality, the essence of the soul. If a warrior was brave, maybe it was because his blood ran hotter. If someone was cowardly, well, perhaps their blood was too thin. And if you were unlucky enough to fall ill, your neighbours might whisper that the balance of your blood had tipped toward corruption. In Mesopotamia, you picture healers pressing amulets shaped like tiny vessels of blood, hoping to channel divine strength. The Babylonians left behind cuneiform tablets that hinted at blood as a symbolic bridge between humans and gods. Egyptians, too, leaned into the mystery. They described blood in medical papyri as a channel of vital force, linking heart, vessels, and breath. You imagine lying in that desert heat while a physician mutters over your pulse, convinced that the river of life inside you flows directly into your destiny. And then there's the Romans. Their gladiator arenas weren't just about spectacle, they also gave rise to a bizarre medicinal practice. Picture someone scraping warm blood from the chest of a fallen fighter, believing it could treat epilepsy if consumed quickly enough. It's one of those moments where you, listening centuries later, can't help but mutter, "That's not in the nutrition guide." Still, people clung to the idea. Historians still argue whether Romans truly practiced widespread drinking of blood, or if these stories were exaggerated gossip passed around by their enemies. But the fact remains, blood was a commodity of healing, however grotesque it might sound. As centuries turned, you notice that the concept of blood as life didn't weaken. It only got stranger. Medieval Europe carried over Greco-Roman ideas, especially humoral theory. Blood wasn't just red stuff in your veins, it was your personality. Too much, and you were supposedly cheerful and energetic, maybe a bit reckless. Too little, and you'd be sluggish, pale, and melancholy. Doctors prescribed diets to thicken or lighten the blood, almost like chefs trying to perfect a sauce. You chuckle imagining a medieval cook yelling, "Needs more bile?" Yet beneath all these rituals and superstitions was a flicker of curiosity. What if you could actually take blood from one person and put it into another? The thought lingered, whispered through myths and miracle tales. Saints were said to bleed endlessly without dying, their blood curing the faithful who touched it. Alchemists toyed with the dream of eternal youth, hinting that blood might be the elixir they were chasing. Even folkloric vampires, those pale figures haunting villages in Eastern Europe, emerged from this deep obsession with blood as vitality stolen. You can see how it all built the stage for the wild experiments to come. Of course, none of these ancient attempts were transfusions in the modern sense. They were rituals, symbolic gestures, or desperate cures drawn from myth. But when you strip away the superstition, what you see is a constant, restless question. If blood is life, can it be shared? The irony is that for all their chanting and sacrifice, people didn't understand circulation. They didn't even grasp that blood travelled in a loop. Instead, they pictured it slowly seeping in and out of organs, or being manufactured and consumed like fuel. Imagine owning a car but being convinced the gasoline just disappears into the seats. That's how medicine worked for centuries. Yet, standing in that candlelit temple or bustling Roman street, you realise something important. These ideas weren't just quaint mistakes. They set the emotional and cultural weight that would later crash down on the first doctors to actually pierce a vein and try moving blood from one body to another. When those doctors failed, and they often did, it wasn't just science collapsing, it was myth shattering. So tonight, as you drift along this strange current, you're watching the roots grow, ancient rituals, gladiator blood cures, humours, and holy relics. All of them set the stage for a dangerous idea that would keep resurfacing, no matter how many times it nearly killed someone. And maybe, as you lie there with your eyes closing, you start to feel the eerie truth. Blood has always been more than biology. It's a story humans have told themselves about what life means, and whether we can borrow it, trade it, or even steal it. You carry the image forward. No more temples, no more gladiator dust, but the thick stone walls of medieval Europe. Here, the air smells of smoke and damp straw, and superstition clings like a fog. The candle flickers while a physician, cloaked in heavy robes, opens a leather-bound book, ready to prescribe his favourite cure, more bloodletting. The irony is sharp. You're learning about the bizarre history of transfusions. But in this era, no one even dares to imagine giving blood. The opposite is true. They're taking it away. You picture a nobleman stretched out on a long bench, a vein opened in his arm, a brass bowl catching the crimson flow as the physician assures him that the excess humours, the misaligned energies, are draining out with it. You can almost hear the patient groan and mutter, "Are you sure this will help?" And the physician nodding smugly, "Oh yes, it worked for Aristotle." Bloodletting dominated medicine for centuries, sometimes with leeches crawling over a pale wrist, sometimes with a lancet flicking into the skin. People truly believed that health depended on keeping blood, phlegm, and bile balanced. Too much blood? You might be sanguine, cheerful, red-cheeked, too energetic for your own good. A little cut would fix that. Too little? Well, then you were melancholy, and bleeding wouldn't help, but doctors would happily try anyway. Historians still argue whether the practice killed more people than it saved, but it remained astonishingly popular right through the Middle Ages. It wasn't just doctors, either. Folk healers and even barbers joined in, hence the striped barber pole, a symbol of bandages and blood. Imagine strolling through a medieval town, hearing someone yell, "Need a haircut and a quick vein opening, step right in." You wince at the thought, but that was reality. Beyond bloodletting, medieval medicine treated blood as an almost magical element. In charms and spells, drops of blood sealed oaths, cured ailments, or warded off evil spirits. One manuscript whispers that drinking the blood of a healthy youth could treat consumption, while another claims that menstrual blood mixed with herbs could drive out demons. You can't help but grin. Medieval medicine sometimes reads like a horror recipe book, complete with ingredients you'd rather not keep in your pantry. And then, of course, came relics. Pilgrims flocked to cathedrals where vials of holy blood, sometimes said to be Christ's own, were displayed. Imagine the throngs pressing forward, candles in hand, convinced that one glimpse of this sacred liquid might cure a lame leg or failing eyesight. Were they real? Scholars debate that endlessly. Some relics turned out to be suspiciously red wax or clotted animal fluids, but the faithful believed, and belief itself was a powerful medicine. By the 14th century, plague swept across Europe, and with it, new desperation. Doctors in those iconic bird-like masks stuffed their beaks with herbs and pointed their canes at patients while prescribing, you guessed it, bloodletting. You lie there, listening, and almost see the dark humour in it. Faced with one of the deadliest diseases in history, their best answer was to make sure you had even less blood. But superstition didn't stop at draining veins. Some healers wrote of blood baths, where frail elders soaked in tubs of animal blood to rejuvenate their skin. You imagine someone lowering themselves into a steaming vat of crimson, sighing, "Ah, yes, I feel at least 10 years younger," while onlookers wrinkle their noses. Was it common? Probably not. But the fact that such stories appear in medical folklore shows just how deeply people linked blood to vitality. In all of this, the seeds of transfusion are quietly planted. If blood is powerful enough to be drained, drunk, soaked in, or worshipped, then why not transferred? The question hovers like smoke over the centuries. Of course, no one had the faintest idea how circulation worked, or what would happen if you tried. The danger, the potential, the sheer strangeness. It was all waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, universities slowly blossomed. You picture medical students huddled in cold lecture halls, copying texts by Galen, the ancient authority whose words were treated as sacred law. Galen believed blood was made in the liver, consumed by the body, and constantly replenished. He was wrong, but no one dared to challenge him for 1,000 years, so physicians bled their patients, chanted prayers, and swore by tradition, and patients, with little choice, accepted it. You find yourself almost dozing as this rhythm unfolds. Cut, drain, leech, pray. And yet, through it all, there's a strange comfort. Even if the methods were misguided, the intent was clear. People wanted to heal, to balance, to restore life through the mystery of blood. By the late Middle Ages, whispers of experimentation began to stir. Alchemists toyed with mixing blood and potions, hoping to unlock eternal youth. Some wrote of transferring vital spirit between animals, though their methods were more symbolic than surgical. You imagine them in shadowy labs, candles guttering, muttering Latin while dropping a clot of blood into a bubbling flask. They weren't close to transfusion yet, but the curiosity was simmering, ready to boil over once the Renaissance dawned. And so, as you roll the thought around in your mind, you realize this era wasn't about needles or tubes. It was about building the mythology of blood. Medieval people carved it into their medicine, their faith, their magic. And when transfusion finally arrived, it wasn't just a medical act. It was a collision with centuries of superstition, a thunderclap against the old rhythms of leeches and relics. You drift onward into the Renaissance, where the medieval haze of incense and superstition begins to clear. The streets are still narrow and cobbled, the air still tinged with wood smoke, but there's a new electricity sparking through Europe. Curiosity. Artists are sketching anatomy with startling precision. Explorers are charting seas, and in lecture halls, physicians are finally daring to peel back the body's mysteries rather than just quoting Galen word for word. The turning point arrives in the early 1600s, when you picture a soft-spoken English physician, William Harvey, pacing around a dissecting table. It's 1628, and Harvey's about to publish a radical idea. Blood doesn't vanish mysteriously into tissues, it moves in a circle. The heart is not a furnace burning blood away, it's a pump, a literal pump. That revelation feels so obvious to you now that it's almost funny. But in the 17th century it shook the medical world like an earthquake. Imagine explaining to someone who's convinced the sun circles the earth that, no, actually, it's the other way around. That's the level of shock Harvey triggered. You lean closer in your imagination, watching Harvey demonstrate. He ties a ligature around an arm, presses a vein, and shows how blood flows in one direction, pushed by valves. He carefully measures, calculates, proves that the volume pumped each heartbeat would otherwise require the liver to manufacture gallons upon gallons of fresh blood every hour. Clearly impossible. His work, De Motu Cordis, on the motion of the heart and blood in animals, is published, and suddenly the river of life looks less like magic and more like engineering. Of course, not everyone claps. Many physicians, steeped in Galenic tradition, scoff. Circulation? Nonsense, they sneer. Historians still argue whether Harvey's contemporaries fully grasped his theory or quietly ignored it out of professional pride. But cracks were showing in the old world view, and soon those cracks would burst open into experiment. The Renaissance spirit thrived on spectacle and proof. You can imagine students gathered in anatomy theatres, tiered wooden balconies overlooking a central table, watching as professors cut open cadavers to demonstrate Harvey's claims. The crowd murmurs, some pale with fascination, others turning green at the smell. The heart beats in diagrams, blood vessels are traced with coloured wax, and suddenly people are seeing their own insides not as divine mystery but as plumbing. And with plumbing comes the tinkerer's instinct. If blood circulates, why not redirect it? Why not supplement it? The thought is reckless, but irresistible. The Renaissance was a time when curiosity often outpaced caution. Telescope lenses were ground sharper than ethics, and gunpowder was tested before anyone thought to invent earplugs. The idea of moving blood between bodies fit right into that daring spirit. But before anyone reached for a lamb or a syringe, there were smaller, stranger detours. Scholars dabbled in sympathetic medicine, the notion that wounds could be healed by treating the weapon that caused them, often with blood involved. You picture a nobleman's sword, its blade carefully smeared with herbs and dried blood, tucked into a special salve. The patient would be left alone, while the doctor fussed over the sword, murmuring incantations. And yet, people swore it worked. Was it placebo? Coincidence? Or maybe just the soothing comfort of ritual? Historians still argue about how widespread this practice truly was, but the fact that it existed at all shows how flexible the imagination around blood could be. Meanwhile, Harvey's theory began to spread slowly beyond England, across Europe. Translations of his work found curious readers, students, experimenters, philosophers, and gradually, skepticism turned to intrigue. If blood could be measured and moved, maybe it could be manipulated. The line between anatomy lesson and laboratory experiment blurred. At the same time, Renaissance courts loved novelty. Princes and patrons funded strange experiments as entertainment as much as science. You imagine a lavish chamber, candles glittering on gold goblets, while an anatomist demonstrates blood movement on a bound dog or a dissected cadaver. Courtiers gasp, applaud, gossip. Science was spectacle, and spectacle demanded daring. This daring sometimes veered into the absurd. There were rumours of alchemists trying to distill essence of blood into powders or tinctures, hoping to capture vitality without the mess. One recipe suggested mixing blood with wine and spices to preserve youth. You smile thinking of it as the Renaissance version of an energy drink. Did it work? No, unless you count food poisoning as rejuvenation. But the hunger to harness blood's power was unmistakable. You also sensed the shadow of religion lingering. Even as science advanced, the church still loomed large. The heart and blood were not only physical but spiritual symbols, the sacred heart of Christ, the bleeding stigmata of saints. Any attempt to meddle with blood risked accusations of sacrilege. Still, the appetite for discovery proved stronger than fear. Slowly, surgeons began experimenting with transfusions between animals, setting the stage for what comes next. The Renaissance, then, was a hinge in the story. Before, blood was mystical, intangible, mostly drained or revered. After Harvey, it became a system, measurable, mechanical, open to intervention. The leap from blood as symbol to blood as fluid you could transfer was vast, but here you can feel it narrowing. The imagination is awake, the scalpels are sharpened, and somewhere in the candlelit halls of Europe, a physician is staring at a beating heart and thinking, "What if?" You exhale, noticing how this moment carries both awe and dread. The knowledge is revolutionary, but the consequences, well, those experiments are coming, and you probably wouldn't want to volunteer. You follow the thread now into the restless 17th century, when Harvey's revelations about circulation ripple outward and embolden a new breed of experimenter. Picture crowded lecture halls, the smell of tallow candles, and physicians with eager eyes and ink-stained fingers, determined not just to describe the motion of blood, but to meddle with it. Curiosity sharpens into courage, or maybe recklessness. One of the first bold figures is Richard Lower, an English physician with a knack for anatomy and a taste for spectacle. You imagine him in Oxford, standing over a restrained dog, carefully slipping a silver tube into its neck vessel. His idea is simple in theory and shocking in practice. Move blood from one animal into another and see what happens. Tubes clink, clamps squeak, and the warm rush of blood begins to flow across species boundaries. To his astonishment, and to the gasps of onlookers, the animal recipient sometimes survives. Not only survives, but perks up, shaking its head and licking its muzzle as if nothing had happened. You can almost hear the applause, mixed with nervous laughter. Lower's experiments reveal something radical. Transfusion might actually be possible. Of course, many of his test subjects didn't fare so well, but the fact that some did was enough to fuel excitement. Meanwhile, across the channel, French physician Jean-Baptiste Denis is watching closely. Paris in the 1660s is a city buzzing with intellectual fervour. Coffee houses, salons, and the Royal Academy of Sciences. Denis, backed by powerful patrons, decides to leap from animal experiments straight to human trials. You shiver at the thought, imagining him preparing a young patient, a boy weakened by fever, for one of the earliest recorded transfusions. The donor, a lamb. Denis believed that animal blood, lighter and purer, might calm human maladies, so he transfused small amounts of lamb's blood into the boy's veins. Miraculously, the boy survived, encouraged. Denis tried again on other patients. Some improved. Others suffered chills and dark urine, clear signs of rejection we now understand as immune response. At the time, though, no one knew why. The line between cure and catastrophe blurred dangerously. You almost laugh at the logic. Feeling anxious? Try a dash of sheep's blood. Yet to them, it seemed reasonable. Historians still argue whether Denis truly believed in therapeutic animal qualities, or whether it was more about spectacle and royal favour. What's clear is that he wasn't alone. All over Europe, physicians dabbled, debated, and argued over the promise and peril of transfusion. The stories swirl darker when tragedy strikes. In one case, a patient given calf's blood convulsed and died, sparking outrage. Denis himself became embroiled in scandal when one of his patients, transfused multiple times, passed away. The patient's widow accused Denis of murder. Though Denis was acquitted, the damage was done. Suddenly, the excitement of transfusion turned to fear. Pamphlets mocked the idea of mixing species, and satirical drawings showed humans sprouting sheepish features after transfusions. At the same time, Richard Lower continued refining his methods in England. He even transfused blood directly between humans, a bold move that technically succeeded, though with unpredictable results. You can imagine the scene: two men sitting side by side, veins opened, blood literally flowing from one arm to another through crude tubing, while observers held their breath. Some lived to tell the tale, others did not, and still, the experiments marched forward, driven by equal parts hope and hubris. The Royal Society in London debated these matters intensely. Learned men argued whether transfusion was the dawn of a new medical era or the height of folly. One faction saw endless possibilities: curing madness, prolonging life, perhaps even sharing personality traits through blood. Another group warned of hubris, of God's wrath, of unnatural tampering. This debate wasn't just medical, it was cultural. In coffee houses, patrons joked nervously about sprouting wool after a transfusion. Theological critics thundered that mixing the essence of different creatures was blasphemy. And somewhere in the middle sat desperate patients, willing to try anything in the hope of relief. It's striking, listening centuries later, how quickly humanity leaped from mysticism to mechanism. Just a generation after Harvey mapped circulation, physicians were already inserting quills, tubes, and cannulas into veins. The audacity is breathtaking and terrifying. Imagine offering yourself as a volunteer in 1667, watching as a physician readies a silver syringe filled with lamb's blood. You'd probably ask, "Are you sure this is safe?" And the physician, with total confidence, would say, "Absolutely not." And yet, despite the failures, this period proved something crucial. Transfusion wasn't impossible. It could work, if only someone figured out why it often didn't. That puzzle, why some lived and others died, would haunt medicine for centuries, until scientists unraveled the mystery of blood groups. But for now, the world stood at the edge of a dangerous new frontier. As you sink into this story, eyelids heavy, you realize how fragile those first steps were. A handful of doctors with crude tools dared to open the human body to rivers of borrowed life. Some patients rose, others fell, and history never forgot either. The current of curiosity carried forward, unstoppable, even through scandal and bans. You move with the story into Paris, 1667, where the air carries the chatter of salons, horse-drawn carts clattering over cobblestones, and a city freshly addicted to both coffee and controversy. Here, transfusion reaches its first true crossroads. Jean-Baptiste Denis, the young royal physician you met before, is about to test his theories on a grand stage, and the results will ripple across Europe. Denis believed that the blood of animals, especially gentle ones like lambs, held calming, even healing properties. So when he prepared to transfuse a Parisian youth, feverish and weak, he wasn't simply attempting science, he was applying a philosophy. Lamb's blood, pure and mild, would soothe the boy's overexcited humours, almost like lavender tea injected straight into the veins. Against all odds, the boy survived. The news raced through Paris, earning Denis a mixture of fame, scepticism, and curiosity. Encouraged, Denis pressed forward. A second patient, a labourer racked by fever, also endured the procedure, though not without strange side effects, dark urine, chills, and a violent sweat. Denis chalked it up to cleansing, but it was the body screaming rejection. Still, word spread that transfusion could work. Then came Antoine Mauroy, a man whose erratic behaviour, what we'd now call psychiatric illness, made him a candidate in Denis's eyes. Perhaps the mild blood of a calf could tame his agitation. The procedure began. Warm animal blood coursed into Mauroy's veins. At first, he quieted, astonishing onlookers. But the calm didn't last. Soon he suffered fever, vomiting, and agony. Days later, Mauroy was dead. The aftermath was explosive. Mauroy's widow accused Denis of murder, dragging the physician into court. Though Denis argued that poison administered by the wife was the true cause, and the court acquitted him, the scandal shattered public trust. Transfusion, once a glittering promise, became a dangerous joke. Pamphlets mocked the idea with cartoons of men sprouting horns or bleating like sheep. Coffeehouse gossip snickered that transfusion was little more than alchemy with extra steps. The Paris medical faculty stepped in, condemning transfusion as reckless. The French Parliament followed, officially banning the practice. Across the Channel, England soon echoed the restrictions. Even the Pope weighed in, wary of meddling with God's design. The message was clear. Transfusion was too risky, too unnatural, too scandal-ridden to continue. And yet, you sense the irony. These early disasters weren't simply failures of imagination, they were failures of knowledge. Nobody in the 1660s understood blood types, immune reactions, or clotting. To them, transfusion was like swapping water between buckets. They didn't realize that human blood carried invisible markers that could spell survival or death. Historians still argue whether Dennis might have stumbled onto transfusion's promise had he chosen only human donors. But the bans silenced the debate for more than a century. You can almost picture Dennis himself, once the darling of Parisian medicine, now a figure of ridicule. His career faltered, his reputation faded, and transfusion slipped into the shadows of forbidden science. But the idea never died entirely. Somewhere in the back of Europe's collective mind, the memory of those brief successes, the boy who lived, the labourer who endured, glowed like embers waiting for fresh fuel. Meanwhile, the cultural fallout was just as strange. Satirists lampooned transfusion as if it were witchcraft. One English pamphlet joked about husbands requesting bull's blood to become stronger, or wives demanding peacock blood for vanity. The fear wasn't just medical, it was social. If transfusion blurred the boundaries between species, or even between classes of people, what would that mean for identity, for the soul? For you, lying here listening, the story feels like a parable. Bold curiosity charges ahead, trips over its own ignorance and leaves scandal in its wake. And yet, isn't that how much of science evolves? You try, you fail, you scandalize, and eventually you learn. The 17th century transfusion craze burned bright and fast, a candle snuffed by tragedy. But as you let your eyes close, you sense that the flame was never truly extinguished. The embers would smoulder through the Enlightenment, waiting for a time when science could match ambition with understanding. You drift now into the hush of the 18th century, where transfusion lay dormant like a forgotten manuscript gathering dust. Europe's courts had banned it. Physicians turned their gaze elsewhere, and the very word transfusion carried a whiff of scandal. To suggest it aloud in a lecture hall was to risk laughter, or worse, suspicion of quackery. And yet, the century was not idle. While needles and animal veins were pushed aside, other aspects of blood began to take centre stage. You imagine yourself moving quietly through lecture theatres in London, Paris, or Edinburgh, where scholars debated the mysteries of circulation, clotting, and vitality. William Harvey's earlier revelation that the heart pumped blood in an endless circuit was no longer controversial, but its consequences were still unfolding. Think of blood not as a red liquid, but as a question. What makes life flow? The 18th century sought answers by experimenting with transfusion's cousin, bleeding. Bloodletting was the reigning therapy for nearly everything: fever, madness, headaches, even pregnancy complications. A patient's health was believed to hinge on balancing the humours, and blood was the easiest humour to remove. Doctors wielded lancets, scarificators, and leeches with a confidence we now find chilling. It was not transfusion, but its dark mirror. Instead of giving blood, physicians took it away. And in the shadows of this obsession, a few curious figures whispered about the opposite. What if instead of draining, one could replenish? The bans silenced public trials, but private speculation never entirely ceased. A handful of philosophers mused on the idea of blood as a transferable essence, life's currency, temporarily shelved until science could print clearer notes. Meanwhile, chemistry crept into the picture. Antoine Lavoisier, the brilliant French chemist, studied respiration and the role of oxygen in sustaining life. Though he did not attempt transfusion, his work hinted at a more mechanistic view of blood, that it was not mystical but chemical, a carrier of gases and energy. He was guillotined during the Revolution, but his discoveries lingered, foreshadowing a world where transfusion could be understood through molecules rather than metaphors. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on rationality, also reshaped how people thought of the body. Instead of divine vessels filled with humours, humans became complex machines, intricate systems of pipes, levers, and fluids. In this new framework, transfusion no longer seemed like heresy. It seemed like an engineering problem waiting for the right tools. Still, the 18th century remained a long pause. Imagine a candle burning low in a library where scholars copy notes on circulation and conduct dissections by lamplight. The question of transfusion lingers in the margins, but no one dares centre it. For most physicians, the risks, socialist, professional and legal, were too steep. Better to bleed a patient conventionally than to revive a practice that had killed Moroi and shamed Dennis. Yet, beneath the silence, small shifts mattered. Needles improved, syringes became more reliable, and anatomical knowledge deepened. By the century's close, a new medical landscape was forming. Hospitals were expanding, military conflicts were producing vast numbers of wounded, and physicians were beginning to think about interventions more precise than the old humoral balance. You sense that the story here is less dramatic than in the 1600s. No scandals in courtrooms, no pamphlets mocking goat blood men, but the quiet decades were essential. They kept the idea from vanishing completely, even as it retreated underground. When the bans were eventually lifted, transfusion would re-emerge into a world more prepared to understand it. For you, lying still, this century feels like a lullaby between storms. No lamb's blood racing through veins, no riots of controversy, just the soft murmur of thought, the patient turning of pages, the slow polishing of tools. Science often advances like this, not in leaps, but in long silences where ideas wait, hidden, until the world is ready to receive them. The 18th century ends with transfusion still dormant, but the stage is being quietly set. Soon, revolution, political, scientific, and industrial, will sweep through Europe, and with it, the forbidden practice will stir again, blinking into the light of possibility. The hush of the 18th century fades, and you step softly into the 19th, where the world begins to buzz with restless energy. Factories thrum, trains whistle, and medicine, like the industrial engine itself, sputters and sparks with experimentation. You find yourself wandering through crowded lecture halls and dim hospital wards, where the word transfusion is spoken again, no longer as scandal but as curiosity reborn. Why now? Partly because of desperation. Disease ravaged populations in ways that humble bloodletting could not solve. Cholera outbreaks rolled across cities like tidal waves. Childbirth remained perilous. War returned again and again, spilling more blood than any leech could draw. In such a landscape, the idea of replenishing what was lost became irresistible. One of the first voices to rise was James Blundell, a London obstetrician. It is 1818, and you imagine him leaning over a woman pale and fading after childbirth hemorrhage. He sees the cruel irony. Her body bleeds life away while her husband stands helpless by her side. Blundell makes the radical leap. Why not take blood from the husband and give it to the wife? He devises crude instruments, funnels and syringes cobbled together, and performs what is widely regarded as the first human-to-human transfusion in Britain. The patient survives, not always, but often enough that whispers turn into genuine attention. Here lies a turning point. For centuries, transfusion had flirted with animals, lambs, calves, goats. The whole barnyard had offered up their veins. But Blundell recognised something intuitive: human blood for humans. His cases were not all successful, many patients still died, but the survival rate was enough to make transfusion shimmer again on the edge of respectability. Blundell also set a precedent that transfusion could be therapeutic, not just speculative. He wrote carefully of his methods, urging caution while acknowledging promise. In a century of bold claims and miracle tonics, his cautious tone was almost radical in itself. Historians still argue whether his trials represented true scientific progress or simply well-packaged improvisation. Yet, without them, transfusion might have remained a ghost story. Around Blundell's work, others began tinkering. Some used animal blood again, unable to shake the older traditions. One experimenter even injected milk, hoping its whiteness would cleanse the blood like soap in a basin. Spoiler, it did not. Patients often reacted violently, their veins swelling, their lungs failing. But the impulse behind these trials reveals the century's hunger, to pour new fluids into the body, to see if vitality could be bottled and transfused. You picture one particularly unsettling experiment. Physicians transfusing sheep blood into tubercular patients, promising them strength. Some patients felt brief surges of warmth or euphoria, perhaps placebo, perhaps shock. Others convulsed. Some died. And yet the reports were published, feeding the fascination. Meanwhile, the century gave transfusion a stage it had never had before. War. The Napoleonic conflicts, then the Crimean War, then the American Civil War, all left surgeons knee-deep in wounded men. Amputations were common, and blood loss was the silent killer. Surgeons dreamed of a way to restore what was spilling onto their boots. They experimented desperately in field hospitals, sometimes transfusing, sometimes failing, often recording the results with heartbreaking honesty. But it was not just desperation that fueled the revival. It was also new tools. The syringe, improved by Irish physician Francis Rind, allowed more controlled injections. Needles became sharper, less likely to shred veins. Glass equipment could be sterilized with boiling water. Though germs were not yet fully understood, each technological tweak made transfusion less fantastical, more feasible. At the same time, transfusion's reputation oscillated wildly. For every successful case, another horror story followed. A child saved from hemorrhage one week, a soldier dead from convulsions the next. Newspapers alternated between praising transfusion as a miracle and damning it as folly. It was medicine on trial again, but this time the jury was the industrial age, eager for progress but unwilling to tolerate too much risk. By mid-century, the debates grew heated. Should transfusion be attempted only as a last resort, or could it be a standard therapy? Was human-to-human blood safe, or did it carry hidden dangers? Some physicians swore by it, others ridiculed it as superstition dressed in glass syringes. And then, as the century drew on, chemistry and microscopy began to pry open the very nature of blood. Scientists peered through lenses at red cells and white cells, sketching their shapes like lunar craters. They noted clumping, clotting, strange reactions that hinted at invisible incompatibilities. Something in the blood itself seemed to resist being shared. You linger on this image, a 19th century laboratory, candlelight flickering over brass microscopes, doctors in frock coats leaning close, whispering about the secrets of blood. The transfusion revival had brought them here, to the threshold of discovery. They did not yet know about blood groups, but they sensed a mystery waiting just beyond the glass. The century ends with transfusion no longer banned, no longer forgotten, but still perilous. A therapy poised between miracle and menace. You feel the momentum building, like a wheel turning faster. Soon, a quiet Austrian scientist will stumble upon the code that changes everything. But for now, the 19th century leaves you with an uneasy balance, hopeful, uncertain, and filled with questions. The wheel of the 19th century clicks forward, and you arrive in a small laboratory in Vienna. the air thick with pipe smoke and the scent of formaldehyde, here, at the turn of the 20th century. Karl Landsteiner peers through his microscope, sliding glass plates beneath the lens with the patience of a watchmaker. You lean over his shoulder in the imagination of this bedtime stroll and see what he sees: tiny red discs floating in pale liquid, clumping together when mixed with blood from another person. It is 1901 when Landsteiner makes the leap. He realizes that blood is not a universal substance but comes in types: A, B, AB, and O. Suddenly, the centuries of confusion and death make sense. The failed transfusions, the convulsions, the inexplicable reactions. They were not curses or chance, but chemistry. Blood was not one language, but 4 dialects. And unless you matched them correctly, the conversation ended in chaos. Historians still argue whether Landsteiner's discovery alone would have been enough to save transfusion's reputation, or whether the world was already primed by industrial progress and new medical institutions. But what's certain is this: without him, transfusion would have remained guesswork, half miracle, half gamble. With him, it became something else entirely: predictable, even safe. Imagine the relief of physicians who'd spent decades playing dice with veins. Now they could test, categorize, and match. Patients no longer needed to rely on luck. Instead, medicine gained a toolkit of compatibility. If you were type O, you could give to anyone. If you were AB, you could receive from everyone. Suddenly, blood had a map, and the map could be read. Of course, the story doesn't end with Landsteiner. The early 20th century brims with follow-up discoveries. Other scientists identified the rhesus factor, yet another layer of compatibility. The puzzle pieces clicked into place, transforming transfusion from fringe speculation into a cornerstone of modern medicine. And yet, the path was not instantly smooth. Hospitals now had the knowledge, but not the infrastructure. How do you store blood? How do you prevent it from clotting before reaching a patient? Early attempts to preserve blood outside the body often failed, the crimson fluid turning into useless jelly. Still, doctors experimented with anticoagulants, refrigeration, and sterile bottles. Each breakthrough nudged transfusion closer to reliability. Picture an early 20th century operating theatre. White tiles, gleaming instruments, a patient stretched out under the sharp glare of lamps. A nurse brings in a donor, often a family member, seated nearby with a vein tapped and connected by tubes to the patient. Blood flows directly, person to person, like a private river bridging bodies. There is intimacy in the process, a raw proximity. 2 lives literally tethered together. Quirky details pepper this era too. In some hospitals, staff joked about blood couplings, because donor and recipient often sat within arm's reach, staring awkwardly while the transfusion trickled on. And when the transfusion succeeded, the sense of wonder never dimmed, pale cheeks flush with colour, laboured breath steady, a heartbeat that had nearly stilled beginning to thrum again. Still, skeptics remained. Some physicians dismissed transfusion as unnecessary, preferring tried-and-true methods like saline infusions. Others feared infection from shared needles or doubted the new science of blood types. Even in Landsteiner's wake, adoption was uneven. Historians still debate how quickly his discovery filtered through medical communities, whether it was embraced or resisted depending on geography and tradition. But the tide was irreversible. Blood had been decoded, and the world was never the same. By the 1920s, transfusion was no longer an experiment whispered about in dim corners. It was a practice that could be taught, standardized, and deployed with confidence. Landsteiner himself would win the Nobel Prize in 1930, long after his microscope had first revealed the secret patterns of clumping cells. You lie there now, imagining that tiny Viennese lab, so unassuming, so ordinary. The wooden table scarred with scratches, the gas lamps hissing faintly, the quiet man with a meticulous gaze jotting notes by hand. From this simple room sprang a revolution, one that would save soldiers, mothers, children, strangers yet unborn, a revolution that transformed transfusion from risky theatre into everyday salvation. The silence of the 18th century is gone. The wild improvisations of the 19th century have been tamed. The 20th century opens with clarity. Blood has rules, and now humans can play by them. And with that clarity, medicine steps confidently into a new era, ready to face the storms of modern war and pandemic. The secret has been revealed, but the story is far from over. The century ahead will test transfusion not in theory or private wards, but on battlefields drenched in loss, in cities crumbling under bombs, in laboratories racing against time, and you, drifting deeper into sleep. Feel the anticipation of what is to come, the way science always seems to wake just as the world most desperately needs it. You step now into the roar of the early 20th century, where the world teeters between invention and catastrophe. The discovery of blood groups has just opened the door, and already history pushes transfusion onto its harshest stage, the battlefield. War, as grim as it is, often accelerates medicine, and blood transfusion was no exception. Picture the First World War, trenches zigzagging across Europe, mud sucking at boots, artillery shaking the ground, and young men collapsing not from bullets alone but from the quiet drain of blood loss. In these moments, transfusion shifts from experiment to necessity. Surgeons, overwhelmed by the endless flow of casualties, scramble to stabilize patients long enough to move them off the front lines. Blood, in all its urgency, becomes a weapon as vital as rifles or artillery. Direct transfusion, that awkward tethering of donor and recipient, proved impractical under fire. Who has time to set up two bodies side by side in a trench? The need for stored blood became urgent, and research accelerated. Scientists learned that sodium citrate could prevent clotting, allowing blood to be stored outside the body for a short time. This breakthrough, simple as it sounds, changed everything. Blood could be bottled, transported, even stockpiled. The world had stumbled upon the birth of the blood bank. You imagine an improvised medical tent, rain tapping the canvas, surgeons in bloodied aprons hurrying as stretchers pile up. A bottle of citrated blood stands ready, crimson against the dim lamplight. The tube is inserted, the flow begins, and a soldier who seemed destined to fade suddenly breathes steadier, colour returning to his lips. For the first time, transfusion feels not just miraculous but logistical, something that could scale to the demands of war. Quirky moments still emerged. Of course, some surgeons experimented with bizarre alternatives when blood ran short. Milk made another comeback, this time injected directly into veins, with predictably poor outcomes. Others attempted saline with glucose, treating it like a stand-in for plasma before plasma itself was understood. Even coconut water was once tested as an emergency substitute for blood plasma, an idea both ingenious and deeply questionable. These oddities, while often failures, reveal the desperation of the time. Historians still argue whether the First World War truly cemented transfusion as mainstream, or whether it merely exposed its potential. Some accounts emphasize the scattered, uneven use of transfusions. Others insist the war transformed them from theory into necessity. What's certain is that the battlefield highlighted both the promise and the shortcomings. Blood saved lives, but storage and matching were still fragile arts. Then came the interwar years. Hospitals embraced the idea of blood banks more formally. In 1937, the first true blood bank opened in Chicago under Dr. Bernard Fantus, coining the very term blood bank. His idea was simple but profound. Just as you deposit and withdraw money, you could deposit and withdraw life's fluid. The metaphor stuck, and soon the practice spread. By the late 1930s, London had its own civilian blood banks, anticipating the air raids that would come with the Second World War. And yet, even as transfusion gained ground, doubts persisted. Some doctors resisted the idea of stored blood, fearing contamination or spoilage. Others clung to direct transfusion, mistrusting bottles and preservatives. Historians still debate how quickly the public embraced the idea, whether people saw blood donation as patriotic duty or as unsettling intrusion. But slowly, the system took root. For you, listening now in the quiet. The image is striking. Ordinary citizens rolling up their sleeves, donating blood that would travel far beyond their sight. No longer a private tether between two individuals. Transfusion became communal, almost anonymous. You gave not to your wife, your brother, your child, but to strangers you would never meet. It was a profound reshaping of medicine into a collective enterprise. And all of it was just in time, because soon the world would plunge into an even greater storm, and blood, stored, typed, and banked, would flow across battlefields on a scale no one had imagined. You drift now into the 1940s, and the world is burning again. The Second World War unfolds not in muddy trenches alone, but across oceans, deserts, and skies. Bombs thunder overhead, cities collapse into rubble, and once again, transfusion finds itself thrust into the spotlight, not as an experiment this time, but as a vital lifeline woven into the machinery of survival. By the start of the war, the science of blood had matured. Karl Landsteiner's ABO system was well established. The rhesus factor had been discovered, and sodium citrate allowed safe storage. Yet even with these tools, new challenges loomed. How to supply blood to millions of soldiers scattered across continents? How to move this fragile fluid through chaos and destruction? The solution was both elegant and bold. Plasma. Unlike whole blood, plasma could be dried, shipped, and reconstituted. It didn't matter what blood type you were. Plasma worked as a universal stabilizer. It wouldn't replace red cells for oxygen delivery, but it could buy precious time, preventing shock until full transfusion was possible. Plasma became the currency of wartime medicine, carried in glass bottles and powdered packets. Imagine yourself inside a field hospital during the Blitz. The sirens have barely faded, the ground still trembles, and stretchers arrive one after another. Medics move swiftly, breaking open boxes of plasma shipped from across the Atlantic. They hang the bottles from improvised stands, sometimes broom handles, sometimes bent rifle barrels, and watch as pale golden liquid drips into wounded veins. For many, it meant the difference between life and death. Here's a quirky bit of history. Britain's wartime plasma supply actually depended heavily on donations from the United States, and in one campaign alone, over 13 million units were collected. Posters urged citizens to give your blood, save a life, transforming donation into an act of patriotism. In the US, even Hollywood joined the drive. Movie stars were photographed donating, smiling as if giving blood were glamorous. But beneath the heroism, darker notes lingered. Blood banks of the 1940s were segregated in America. Donations from black Americans were either rejected outright or stored separately. The irony was bitter. Soldiers of all races bled on the battlefield, but their blood was not treated equally in the banks. Historians still argue whether this segregation was driven by genuine medical ignorance or by the inertia of prejudice dressed up as science. Either way, it delayed the realization that blood, regardless of race, carries the same vital power. The war also brought about new logistics. Refrigerated trucks transported blood across bombed landscapes, and aircraft ferried plasma crates over oceans. Blood became as strategic as ammunition. Military planners calculated not just bullets per soldier, but pints of plasma per division. It was medicine industrialized, scaled to match the enormity of global conflict. And through it all, Strange improvisations continued on Pacific islands where supply lines faltered. Medics sometimes attempted direct donor-to-soldier transfusions again, using whatever tubing they could scavenge. In North Africa, plasma overheated in desert sun, turning brittle in glass bottles. Solutions required ingenuity, coolers, shade, constant rotation of supplies. You picture a medic fanning bottles under a palm tree, muttering curses at the relentless heat, knowing lives depended on those fragile fluids. The Second World War reshaped transfusion permanently. When peace returned, blood donation was no longer a curiosity but a civic duty. Hospitals worldwide established permanent blood banks, building on the wartime networks. Ordinary people continued rolling up their sleeves, now not just for soldiers but for mothers in labour, accident victims, children with anemia. The intimacy of transfusion had become anonymous, collective, and routine. For you, resting deeper now, there's something almost tender in this shift. The act of giving blood is one of trust. You never meet the recipient, yet you sustain them. During the war, that trust extended across oceans, across races and borders, though not without flaws. Blood became a quiet emblem of shared humanity, even in the darkest times. The guns eventually fall silent, but transfusion does not retreat. It marches onward, into hospitals and clinics, into every corner of modern life. The experiments of goats and milk and coconut water are gone. In their place stands a system robust enough to support entire nations. And yet, as you'll soon discover, the story of transfusion doesn't stop here. New frontiers, storage, safety, even the very idea of synthetic blood, begin to stir on the horizon. The war ends, but transfusion does not return to silence. It blossoms into a new age of peacetime medicine. You drift into the 1950s and 1960s, where hospitals gleam with stainless steel and doctors wear crisp white coats, their confidence buoyed by antibiotics, vaccines, and an ever-growing supply of donated blood. For the first time, transfusion is not an emergency trick pulled from desperation, but a standard, dependable therapy woven into daily medical practice. Blood drives become routine. Posters in cheerful colours invite office workers, students, and factory hands to roll up their sleeves. Be a hero, give a pint, reads the slogan, and donors oblige, often rewarded with coffee, cookies, or simply the warm glow of altruism. In these decades, transfusion shifts from battlefield logistics to civic ritual. You could give blood at work, at school, even at church. You imagine yourself walking into a gymnasium filled with folding chairs, nurses bustling about, donors chatting idly as bags of blood slowly fill beside them. It feels less like a medical procedure and more like a community gathering. Science too advances. Refrigeration improves, extending the shelf life of blood. Plastic bags replace fragile glass bottles, lighter, safer, easier to transport. This small change revolutionizes the system, cutting breakage and contamination. Historians still argue whether the invention of the plastic blood bag was the single most important innovation after Landsteiner's discovery, but no one denies its impact. At the same time, medicine learns to separate blood into components. Instead of transfusing whole blood, doctors begin to spin it down with centrifuges, separating red cells, plasma, and platelets. Why give everything when a patient needs only one part? Burn victims benefit from plasma, haemophiliacs from clotting factors, anemic patients from red cells. Transfusion becomes not just about replacing volume but about tailoring therapy. Of course, the era is not without quirks. Some hospitals experimented with storing blood in home-style refrigerators, tucked between bottles of milk and jars of jam, a sight that today would make you shiver. And in rural areas, volunteer networks sometimes transported blood on motorcycles, balancing precious bags and coolers strapped with bungee cords. Stories circulated of donors fainting dramatically during drives, only to be revived by the very orange juice meant as their post-donation treat. Still, challenges linger. Transfusion reactions remained a fear, even with typing and cross-matching. Some patients mysteriously deteriorated despite compatibility tests. Historians still debate whether these reactions were due to subtle mismatches, storage lesions, or contaminants invisible to the tools of the time. And then, by the late 1970s, a shadow begins to creep in. Blood, once seen as a near-magical fluid, is revealed to be vulnerable. Hepatitis transmission becomes a recognised risk, prompting stricter screening. Donor questionnaires lengthen, tests improve, but anxiety grows. The public trust in transfusion, so carefully built through war and community drives, faces its first major tremors. For you, resting in the present, the image of this mid-century optimism feels almost golden. Bright posters, orderly blood banks, plastic bags neatly stacked in refrigerators humming softly. It is the calm before a storm, a moment when transfusion seemed simple, generous, and safe. But medicine rarely stays simple for long. Just around the corner lies one of the greatest crises transfusion has ever faced, an invisible virus that would change everything. The storm arrives quietly at first. You're drifting now into the early 1980s, an era of bold fashion, booming music, and rising medical confidence. Yet behind this optimism, something dark begins to whisper. At first, doctors notice unusual infections in young men, pneumonia that should never strike the healthy, cancers blooming in bodies that should have fought them off. The press calls it a mystery illness. The medical journals call it acquired immune deficiency. In time, the world will know it simply as AIDS. Blood, once seen as a gift of life, suddenly becomes suspect. The virus that causes AIDS, HIV, can travel silently within it, undetectable by any test of the day. Thousands of haemophiliacs, dependent on clotting factors distilled from donated plasma, receive treatments carrying the hidden virus. So do surgical patients, accident victims, mothers in labour. Hospitals that once proudly displayed racks of donated blood now carry a subtle tension. Is this life-saving bag safe or deadly? The tragedy unfolds unevenly across countries. In the United States, lawsuits pile high as families demand answers. Why wasn't blood tested sooner? Why were high-risk donors not excluded earlier? In France, ministers fall under investigation for failing to act quickly, accused of knowingly distributing contaminated blood. In Japan, pharmaceutical companies face outrage for delaying the switch to safer products. In each nation, the crisis exposes the fragility of the trust that transfusion depends upon. You imagine the grief of that era. Parents watching children waste away. Patients who entered hospitals expecting healing but left infected. Doctors who realized too late that their cure had carried a curse. The blood banks, once symbols of generosity, suddenly felt like dangerous lotteries. From the wreckage, reforms rise. By the late 1980s, the first HIV tests are introduced. Donor questionnaires become rigorous, sometimes intrusive. Have you ever used intravenous drugs? Have you engaged in high-risk sexual behaviour? Blood services defend the measures as necessary. Activists protest stigma and discrimination. Yet the tests improve, moving from crude antibody screens to exquisitely sensitive nucleic acid tests that detect even the faintest traces of viral material. The crisis reshapes transfusion forever. No longer can doctors assume that donated blood is safe by default. A whole architecture of surveillance, screening, and regulation emerges, designed not just for HIV but for hepatitis, syphilis, malaria, Chagas disease, and a growing list of microbial threats. The simple act of donation now feels like the opening move in a chess match against unseen enemies. For you, lying quietly now, It feels like a reminder of how fragile progress can be. The optimism of the mid-century, with its cheerful posters and plastic bags, shattered against the reality of viruses too small for human eyes. Transfusion did not die, but it was forced to harden, to build shields and defences around itself. And in that hardening appears, a paradox emerges. The gift of blood becomes both more trusted and more surveilled. Donors feel pride, but also scrutiny. Patients feel gratitude, but also fear. The very fluid that unites humanity, red, universal, life-giving, becomes a mirror of society's anxieties about purity, risk, and responsibility. As you drift deeper into the story, you sense the balance tipping. The blood supply has survived the storm, but it has changed. Never again will it be innocent. Never again merely a symbol of generosity. From now on, every drop will be guarded, tested, and questioned. And yet, people still roll up their sleeves, still give, still believe that to share blood is to share life. It is this stubborn generosity, even in the face of fear, that keeps the practice alive. You're floating now into the curious borderlands between medicine and imagination, where serious science brushes against old legends. The idea that young blood might restore vitality is not new. It reaches back to the ancients, who whispered of bathing in virgin's blood or drinking the essence of youth. In the 16th century, philosophers speculated that vitality could be transferred like heat from a flame. But it is in the modern age, armed with scalpels and microscopes, that such dreams take experimental form. One of the strangest chapters unfolds in the 19th century with parabiosis, a procedure in which two animals are surgically joined, their circulatory systems fused so that blood flows between them. At first, these were grotesque spectacles, stitched pairs of rats or dogs shuffling together, as scientists observed how their bodies adapted. But soon the experiments took a more ambitious turn. What if the blood of the young could actually rejuvenate the old? The 20th century brings new tools and new ambition. In the 1950s, scientists suture old and young mice together and record startling results. The aged partner's tissues begin to regenerate more quickly, wounds heal faster, livers grow stronger, muscles stiffened with age appear softer, more pliant, as though the years are melting away. The young, meanwhile, show the opposite effect, sluggish healing, a creeping exhaustion, as if their vitality is siphoned away. It is a haunting mirror of the vampire tales humanity has told for centuries, now dressed in white coats and laboratory lighting. As you drift in this half-lit laboratory, you can almost smell the antiseptic and hear the squeak of metal cages. The idea feels both wondrous and unsettling. Could immortality lie not in elixirs or potions, but in the veins of the young? The results echo across decades, fueling fascination. Even into the 21st century, studies show that injections of young plasma into elderly mice may improve memory, enhance muscle strength, and brighten behaviour. The phrase young blood becomes not just a metaphor but a research term. Inevitably, the whispers escape the lab. By the 2010s, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs seize upon the findings, offering costly transfusions of plasma harvested from young donors. They market it as an anti-aging treatment, promising sharper minds, fresher skin, longer lives. Some clinics charge thousands of dollars for a session. The press erupts with stories that sound more like dark fairy tales than medical news. Billionaires buying youth by the pint, students selling plasma as though it were currency, rich clients chasing eternal vigour. Ethicists recoil. The parallels to exploitation are hard to miss. The old feeding upon the young, wealth drawing vitality from the vulnerable. Governments intervene, warning clinics against unproven claims, reminding the public that rejuvenation remains unproven, its results fragmentary and fragile. Still, the research continues, cautious and methodical. Scientists isolate proteins, growth factors, and hormones that might explain the rejuvenating effect. They debate whether it is truly the young blood adding vigour, or the old blood suppressing it. The answer remains elusive. Yet the dream persists, in a sense. It always has. From alchemists searching for elixirs to emperors chasing fountains of youth, humanity has never stopped hoping that age might be reversible. Transfusion, this once improbable act of exchanging blood, now serves as a new theatre for that timeless longing. For you, listening in the dark, it feels both wondrous and faintly chilling. The line between gift and exploitation, between science and myth, grows thin. Perhaps the story of blood is not just about medicine, but about desire, the desire to live longer, to feel stronger, to defy the slow erosion of time. And as the tale carries you deeper, you sense that the story is not done. There are other shadows ahead, moments when transfusion became not a promise of youth, but a source of fear, scandal, and harm. Yet there is also resilience, invention, and the endless search for a safer, stronger future. You wander now into the darker corners of Transfusion's story, the scandals and mistakes that remind you medicine is not always clean, nor free of human error. For all its promise, the practice has carried with it shadows that ripple through hospitals, communities, and entire nations. One of the earliest modern scandals erupts in the 1980s, when the world is still reeling from the discovery of HIV. Before robust testing is in place, thousands of patients, especially those with haemophilia who require frequent clotting factor infusions, are exposed to contaminated blood products. In some countries, entire generations of patients contract HIV or hepatitis C. Families who once trusted transfusion as life-saving come to see it as a silent threat. Historians still argue whether governments and blood banks acted swiftly enough, or whether denial and bureaucracy prolonged the tragedy. The crisis is not confined to one place. In France, lawsuits and resignations shake the government. In Japan, pharmaceutical executives face prison. In the United States, activists protest in the streets, demanding accountability. Suddenly, blood, the symbol of life, becomes tainted in public imagination. Donors begin to dwindle. Patients weigh risks before consenting. The system must rebuild trust from the ground up. But scandals are not only about disease. In the 1990s and early 2000s, investigative journalists uncovered black markets in blood across the globe. In rural China, unhygienic donation practices spread HIV in villages where people are encouraged, or pressured, to sell plasma for cash. In India and parts of Africa, brokers recruit impoverished donors, skimming profits while cutting corners on safety. You can almost hear the hum of fluorescent lights in backroom clinics, the clink of makeshift equipment, the uneasy silence of people selling something too intimate to price. Even in wealthier nations, corners are cut. Blood shortages sometimes push hospitals to stretch supplies, transfusing older units whose quality is questionable. Patients occasionally receive mismatched blood due to clerical mistakes, swapped labels, hurried handwriting. The results can be fatal. Quirky stories emerge too. Nurses jokingly describing vampire shifts in blood banks, or urban legends of mislabeled bags ending up in cafeterias. The humour, you notice, always carries an edge of unease. And yet, the system adapts. Screening becomes stricter, donor histories more detailed, automated barcoding reduces human error. Some countries ban paid donations entirely, insisting altruism ensures safer blood. Still, debates linger. Should donors be compensated? Does scarcity justify bending the rules? Historians still debate whether strict regulation slows innovation, or whether it is the only safeguard against repeating past mistakes. For you, listening quietly, it feels like a cautionary lull, proof that even noble systems are vulnerable to greed, neglect, or haste. Blood may symbolize unity, but it also exposes inequality: who gives, who receives, who profits. All questions that swirl like sediment at the bottom of a vial. And just when the scandals threaten to overshadow the promise, new discoveries arrive. Researchers push towards synthetic blood, artificial oxygen carriers, and biotechnological substitutes that might one day remove human frailty from the equation entirely. The shadows remind you how high the stakes are, and how much the world yearns for a safer solution. The story of transfusion, you realize, is not just a history of medicine, it is a mirror of humanity, full of light and shadow, generosity and exploitation, triumph and scandal, and it is not done yet. Ahead lies the present and the shimmering horizon of the future. You settle into the present day, where transfusion has become both ordinary and astonishing. Walk into almost any modern hospital, and you'll find the quiet infrastructure of blood humming in the background. Refrigerators the size of wardrobes line the walls of blood banks, filled with neatly labelled bags, red cells stacked like ruby envelopes, plasma frozen into golden bricks, platelets rocking gently on warm shakers so they don't clump. To the untrained eye, it looks unremarkable. To a patient in need, it is everything. Modern transfusion medicine is a symphony of precision. Donors are screened with detailed questionnaires, their samples tested with molecular assays capable of detecting the faintest traces of viruses. Labels are encoded with barcodes, linked to databases that track every unit from vein to vein. The days of guessing compatibility are long gone. Now, matching goes beyond ABO and RH to extended antigens, reducing reactions for patients who receive frequent transfusions, such as those with sickle cell disease. Quirky innovations arise too. In Japan, vending machines dispense bags of plasma, not for human transfusion, but for veterinary use in racehorses. In the United States, researchers experiment with drones carrying blood across traffic-choked cities, dropping supplies onto hospital rooftops with uncanny precision. Rwanda and Ghana lead in using drone fleets to deliver blood to rural clinics, transforming response times from hours to minutes. You picture sleek white drones buzzing across valleys, carrying packets of life strapped like lunchboxes beneath their wings. Historians still argue whether technology is democratizing transfusion or widening gaps. Wealthy nations can afford molecular screening, drones, and vast blood banks, while poorer regions still struggle with shortages and outdated equipment. The debate lingers: is blood a universal right, or a privilege mediated by geography and wealth? And then there's the frontier of synthetic blood. Scientists chase hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers and stem cell-derived red cells, hoping to bypass the need for donors altogether. Some prototypes succeed in mice or emergency trials, though none has yet scaled for routine human use. The promise is dazzling: a shelf-stable, infection-proof substitute that could sit in ambulances, disaster zones, or spacecraft. Imagine astronauts transfusing on Mars, their blood grown not in veins but in bioreactors. Still, quirks remind you medicine is never flawless. Patients sometimes refuse transfusion for religious reasons, prompting creative alternatives: cell salvage machines that recycle a person's own blood during surgery, or volume expanders that keep circulation flowing without carrying oxygen. In some cases, doctors push the limits of medicine to respect beliefs, balancing survival against conviction. For you, listening now, the image of modern transfusion is layered. It is at once routine and miraculous, hidden behind hospital curtains yet present in countless lives saved daily. From trauma victims to cancer patients, from childbirth emergencies to planned surgeries, the quiet drip of a blood bag is a silent guardian. And yet, you sense that this is not the end. Science rarely rests. The future beckons with possibilities stranger than fiction: lab-grown blood, artificial vessels, nanobots swimming through plasma, even the dream of sidestepping blood entirely. The story you have been drifting through, centuries of experiment, scandal, generosity, and hope, stretches toward a horizon you can barely see. You drift now into the horizon of what might come next, where the story of transfusion leaves the hospital ward and enters the laboratory of dreams. Imagine rooms filled with bioreactors humming softly. Vats of crimson liquid grow not in human veins, but coaxed from stem cells. Scientists in white coats stand over microscopes, their voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the fragile miracle of growing blood outside the body. The vision of lab-grown red cells has already begun to take shape. In recent years, researchers have managed to cultivate small batches in controlled environments, proving that stem cells can be nudged into producing mature blood cells. The promise is breathtaking. A limitless supply of type O negative blood, universal and infection-free, ready on demand. Historians still argue whether this breakthrough will ever escape the confines of small-scale experiments, or whether the cost and complexity will keep it more fantasy than fact. Other teams dream differently. They chase artificial oxygen carriers, tiny molecules or nanoparticles designed to mimic hemoglobin. Some are engineered for disaster zones, where blood banks are distant and time is scarce. Others are imagined for space travel, where carrying a fridge full of plasma on a Mars mission is hardly practical. You picture sleek silver pouches of synthetic fluid stacked beside astronaut helmets, humming with possibility. Even stranger frontiers loom. Nanotechnology researchers toy with the idea of programmable particles that could repair damaged vessels, clear clots, or ferry oxygen with microscopic precision. Bioengineers sketch models of universal blood chips that filter and enhance your circulation like tiny dialysis machines running inside your veins. You smile, half asleep, at the sheer audacity. Science rewriting the script of biology itself. Yet with every breakthrough comes hesitation. Questions echo in the background. Will people accept synthetic blood, or fear it as unnatural? Will access be equal, or will only the wealthy sip from the fountain of engineered life? Historians still argue whether the arc of medicine bends toward equity or repetition of old patterns of privilege. Meanwhile, the present still leans on the timeless ritual of donation. Volunteers quietly stretch out their arms, nurses tape tubing in place, and red fluid fills the bag. Cookies, juice, and soft laughter mark the end of the act. It is humble, it is human, and despite every futuristic dream, it remains the foundation. And so the story loops back on itself, from sheep's blood transfused into humans, to battlefield triage, to plastic bags in humming refrigerators, to stem cell farms glowing with blue light. The history of transfusion is at once bizarre, tragic, hopeful, and profoundly ordinary. It is science, myth, and daily kindness braided together. You, lying in the quiet now, feel the tale slow. The buzz of laboratories fades, the drone of hospital machines softens, and even the whisper of imagined futures dissolves into stillness. All that remains is the rhythm of your own heartbeat, steady and calm, carrying you deeper into rest. And here, at the gentle end of our journey, you let your mind grow lighter, softer, as if it too has been transfused with calm. The long corridors of history dim behind you, their odd experiments and bustling hospitals receding into shadows, leaving only the sense of continuity that across centuries humanity has always searched for ways to protect one another, to pass life from one body to the next. You breathe slowly, and with each breath the imagery softens. The bright lights of laboratories blur into a warm glow, and the chatter of scientists becomes a distant murmur, fading like waves against the shore. The sharp details, needles, bags, machines, melt into something more abstract, like ripples of red and gold drifting lazily in the dark. The pace of your thoughts slows to match the hush of your body. You notice how your shoulders sink, how your chest rises and falls with gentle rhythm, how the world beyond your room feels far away. It is as if the story itself has wrapped around you like a blanket, protecting you from the jagged edges of waking life. In this softened place, you carry only the calm, the reassurance that even in strange, winding histories, there is always a thread of hope, always a way forward. You no longer chase the details of experiments or debates. You simply rest in the knowledge that tomorrow will arrive, and with it, new stories to tell. So now, let go of the last flicker of thought, let your breath lengthen, let your eyes grow heavy, and allow the quiet to guide you down into sleep. Safe, steady, unhurried, the journey is complete, and the night welcomes you in.